Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, July 8th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel ordered Hannibal Directive on October 7th. So this is something that we've already known, but more confirmation here from a big report in Haaretz. So a report published by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz on Sunday confirmed that the Israeli military implemented a secretive procedure known as the Hannibal Directive during the response to the October 7th Hamas attack on southern Israel. So this directive allows Israeli forces to prevent Israelis from being taken hostage, even if that means putting their lives in danger. The directive had historically only applied to soldiers, but it was also used on Israeli civilians during the October 7th response. So a very senior source in the Israeli Defense Forces confirmed to Haaretz that the Hannibal Directive was ordered on October 7th. The report also cited documents and testimonies from soldiers and officers and found that the order was given multiple times throughout the day. One of those orders came at 11:22 a.m., hours into the Hamas attack, and the order said that not a single vehicle can return to Gaza. The report said that at this point in the attack, the IDF was not aware of the extent of kidnapping along the Gaza border, but it did know that many people were involved. Thus, it was entirely clear what that message meant and what the fate of some of the kidnapped people would be. There has been other evidence of Israeli forces implementing the Hannibal Directive on October 7th. I linked to a report from the Gray Zone there from October 2023. October 7th testimony reveal Israel's military shelling Israeli citizens with tanks and missiles, so they were on top of it from the beginning here. Another big report that came out was back in January from the Israeli news site Ynet. They just published it in Hebrew. There was no English language version of the report, but I linked to a story from the Electronic Intifada about it. This is actually Brad Pierce's Substack. He also wrote about it at the time in January 2024. But it didn't get much attention, outside of Hebrew language media and kind of, independent English language media. But that report said that about 70 vehicles were destroyed by the Israeli military as they were on their way back to Gaza, and many of those cars were likely carrying Israeli captives. The Ynet report said that the IDF instructed all of its fighting units to perform the Hannibal Directive in practice, although it did so without stating that name explicitly. So that's what the Ynet report said, that they didn't explicitly order the Hannibal Directive. They did it all but in name. But this Haaretz report says that the Hannibal Directive was, in fact, explicitly ordered in some cases, including when the IDF learned that someone was kidnapped near the Erez border crossing. So at 17 a.m. on the morning of October 7th, the IDF's Gaza division gave the order Hannibal at Erez. And again, that's the border crossing. And they dispatched an unmanned assault drone. That's about all the information Haaretz had on that. They didn't say anything of, if that drone hit anything or killed anybody. But then another order was given for the same area, and then several more times throughout the day in response to Hamas attacks on Israeli military outposts in the area. And there's one incident that we've known about for a while, again, even going back to October and November. This is from testimony from a survivor, an Israeli, that's what, the Gray Zone, I know Electronic Intifada, I think Mondo Weiss had some reports on this. Basically, they were just paying attention to the Hebrew language media, and they had interviews with survivors saying, yeah, the Israelis fired on us, or they fired on this house that was full of Israeli hostages. So in this one incident, this was at the kibbutz Beri, Israeli tanks shelled a house that contained Hamas militants and Israeli hostages, killing 13 Israeli civilians, including 12-year-old twin sisters. The officer who ordered the shelling, Brigadier General Barak Haram, acknowledged to the New York Times that he ordered the attack even at the cost of civilian casualties. So that sounds like the Hannibal Directive. They didn't say that it was explicitly ordered for that, but so we know at least 13 Israeli civilians were killed there by the Israeli military. There was a recent UN report that found IDF helicopter fire killed one Israeli woman while she was being abducted from Hamas from the kibbutz near Oz. Haaretz previously reported that an Israeli police report found IDF helicopter fire hit attendees of the Nova Music Festival. We don't know the scale, how many people were hit by the fire, if it killed them, or really many more details than that. But we do know that there's a lot of instances here of the Israeli military firing on Israelis in the response to the October 7th attack. And this very senior IDF source who spoke with Haaretz about the Hannibal Directive did not say who gave the initial order on October 7th, but it likely came from very far up the chain of command. So this Haaretz report said, quote, "Who did give the order? This," said the source, "will perhaps be established by post-war investigations," end quote. And we know Netanyahu is not too keen on investigating the failure on October 7th, the military's response on October 7th. How high up did this Hannibal Directive order go? Did it go all the way up to Netanyahu? I guess it's possible, or to Gallant, the defense minister. So according to the latest figures from Israel, they've adjusted the death toll a few times now. A total of 1,163 Israelis were killed during the October 7th Hamas attack, including 767 civilians, 20 hostages, and 376 members of the security forces. And so we don't know, it's unclear how many of those casualties were due to Israeli fire. I guess we know at least 14. I would guess it's more than that. I know some people claim to know exactly how many, but there's really no way to know. But the Israeli military is expected to release a report this month that found, so there's been kind of a preview. It was leaked to the media that this report's going to come out this month, and it said that it found many casualties due to IDF forces firing on Israeli forces. And this could shed more light on the scale of the IDF killings of Israelis. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, the Israeli military is probably going to try to cover it up. That's certainly possible, but we might get more information. And I think there might be enough people in Israel, pissed off enough about this response to this attack at the government for allowing it to happen. That, I think in the future, as time goes on, we'll probably learn more and more details about this. But all the people who were covering this, from the beginning, of course, were attacked and smeared. And then here you have confirmation that, yes, in fact, Israel did order this very controversial directive and fire on their own people. All right, so the next one here, Israel okays 3 settlements and thousands of West Bank housing units. So this article is from the Palestine Chronicle. The Israeli government has approved 5,295 new housing units in dozens of settlements throughout the occupied West Bank, according to a settlement watchdog group. The Israeli group Peace Now said in a report on Thursday, quote, "The building plans include the expansion of settlements deep within the West Bank and the legalization of 3 outposts," end quote. So this is in addition to 5 settlement outposts approved by the Israeli cabinet last week. And also, if you remember, if this sounds familiar, this happened this past Thursday, but the day before, Israel approved this big land grab. I believe it was about 5 square miles of land that they just have stolen from the Palestinians. And those reports said that they were going to approve about 6,000. So this is them approving the actual construction of the settlement, the settler homes. And right now it's about 5,300 that they have approved, and there's going to be more coming. And this is all about Smotrich, the Israeli finance minister, who's also a minister and basically in charge of the West Bank. And he's a settler, and he wants to conquer the West Bank, annex the West Bank, and kick all the Palestinians out. So this is the result of having someone in charge like that. All right, so the next one here, settler attacks on Palestinians top 1,000 in the West Bank. This article is from the New Arab, more about the West Bank, just kind of an update on the settler violence. Aid agencies have urged action after the number of Israeli settler attacks since October 7th reached 1,000 cases in the occupied West Bank. So it's been 9 months. I'm recording this late Sunday night. It's July 7th while I'm recording. So it's been 9 months of this the atrocities in Gaza and the surge of violence in the West Bank, and there's been over 500 Palestinians killed there, and 1,000 settler attacks. That's quite a bit. In this story, the Association of International Development Agencies, they're calling for authorities to do something about it, but the authorities are totally in cahoots. The Israeli authorities are in cahoots with the settlers, unfortunately. So there's not much recourse here. All right, so the next one here, Netanyahu is sabotaging the chances of a deal with Hamas. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a list of demands for a potential hostage deal ahead of more indirect negotiations between Israel and Hamas, a move seen by mediators and Israeli officials as an attempt to sabotage the chances of an agreement. Netanyahu's list of demands, which he called non-negotiable, included a condition that Israel would be allowed to resume military operations until all the objectives of the war have been achieved. And Netanyahu's objectives include the eradication of Hamas, a goal the Israeli military has said is not realistic, but he's still sticking to that. And Hamas's primary condition for a deal is a permanent ceasefire, and Netanyahu's insistence on having the ability to resume his genocidal war appears to be the main obstacle. The Israeli leader's repeated public comments about the issue led Hamas to ask for stronger guarantees during previous negotiations, and it looks like that might happen again. According to media reports, Hamas has actually softened its stance a bit by not asking for Israel to commit to a permanent ceasefire right away. However, they are looking for the mediators, which are Qatar and Egypt, to provide written guarantees that negotiations for a permanent truce will continue once the first phase of the deal goes into effect. So they're not asking Israel to make the commitment, but they want a guarantee from the mediators, basically, that negotiations would continue after the first phase. And the first phase is a 6-week ceasefire and initial hostage and prisoner exchange. So an Israeli security official told Channel 12 that by issuing his list of demands, Netanyahu is emphasizing the gaps between Israel and Hamas just before an Israeli delegation heads to a fresh round of negotiations. So, the Israeli mediators, I think, are on their way either to Cairo or Doha for the next round of talks, and then Netanyahu just releases this list of demands. And again, the top demand is the thing that's Hamas is completely against, is this idea of Israel resuming military operations. So another Israeli security official slammed Netanyahu, saying that he pretends he wants a deal but is working to torpedo it, and saying that he's dragging out this whole process. So his full list of demands includes, he says that any deal will allow Israel to resume fighting until all objectives of the war have been achieved. There will be no smuggling of weapons to Hamas from Egypt to Gaza. There will be no return of thousands of armed terrorists to northern Gaza Strip. And Israel will maximize the number of living hostages who will be released from Hamas activity. So a senior official from one of the countries mediating the negotiations told the Times of Israel that Netanyahu's demand about the resumption of fighting hits at the most sensitive issue in the negotiations. So if you remember, the thing that, in the last kind of round of negotiations, essentially the Israelis thought that the language was vague enough that they can enter the first phase of the deal and not have to actually commit to a permanent ceasefire. But then Netanyahu kept coming out and saying that he was against a permanent ceasefire. Then Hamas asked for stronger guarantees, and Israel said no. So now Hamas has softened their stance a bit. And basically in response, Netanyahu's doing the same thing. So it clearly looks like he's trying to sabotage this, and that's not just me saying that. That's all over Israeli media. Israeli officials are saying that. And this is because, one reason is because you have Ben Gvir, the Minister of National Security. He's threatening to quit the government, to dissolve the coalition government, which would force new elections. And that would mean, if there was a deal with Hamas, that's what he's saying. And all the polling is showing that Netanyahu wouldn't stand a chance if there was an election right now. So he, of course, has that interest of preserving his government, preserving his power, and sabotaging an agreement. All right, so the next one here, dozens killed across Gaza as Israel's war enters 10th month. This is from Al Jazeera. Just kind of an update on the situation inside Gaza. At least 27 Palestinians have been killed in Israeli airstrikes across Gaza, marking another grim day as the war on the besieged territory enters its 10th month. And this was published on Sunday. One of the attacks since dawn on Sunday targeted a school sheltering displaced people west of Gaza City, killing at least 4 Palestinians. In central Gaza, the Israeli army struck a residential building in the Al-Zawaidi area, killing 6 people. The Palestine Red Crescent Society said the dead included 2 children. The killings came a day after the targeting of a United Nations-run school for the displaced Palestinians, in which at least 16 people were killed and dozens were wounded. Paramedics said 6 other Palestinians were killed in a strike on another house in Gaza City. Israeli jets also targeted a group of civilians on the city's Street 8 in the Sabra neighborhood, killing at least 2 people. And they say that they're launching more attacks in Khan Yunis. So the horror in Gaza continues. The bombardment continues. All right, so the next one here, the war on Gaza is causing a surge in terrorism recruiting, according to a U.S. intel official. So this article is from the Libertarian Institute from Kyle Anzalone. So the State Department's top intelligence officials said that the Israeli war in Gaza is creating a fertile recruitment for Islamic terrorist groups. The official, Brett Holmgren, is set for a promotion from state to the National Counterterrorism Center. So in an interview with the Washington Post, he said, this war in Gaza, this genocide in Gaza, obviously he didn't use that word, but he's basically saying it's a recruiting opportunity for terrorist organizations, as well as an inspiration for lone actors. So the important point here is that, global opinion on Israel is obviously very, very bad at the moment. And you have the United States in Israel's corner, giving them everything they want. So if this does inspire, terrorist attacks, there's been some things in Europe, nothing that significant. Didn't seem like anything's been really organized at any level. But of course, the U.S. This is going to create global resentment for the U.S. I mean, it already has, of course, and it goes to show the support for Israel. In general, not just in these past 9 months, but in general, U.S. support for Israel has made enemies for the U.S. that it wouldn't have if it wasn't so supportive of Israel. And of course, that problem is just getting worse as the Israeli war crimes and atrocities get worse. All right, so the next one here, Russia steps up strikes on Ukrainian airfields. So Russia has stepped up attacks on Ukrainian airfields as Kiev is preparing to receive its first batch of long-awaited U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets. So last week, Russia hit 3 airfields and said that it destroyed a total of 7 aircraft, including 5 Soviet-made Su-27 fighter jets, 1 MiG-29 fighter jet, and 1 Mi-17 helicopter. In each attack, Russia published videos of the strikes as the airfields were being monitored by Russian drones. The successful Russian attacks are raising concern among Ukrainian officials about securing more Western jets. Ukrainian MP Roman Kostenko said, quote, "If we keep losing aircraft in this way, no one will give us more," end quote. So the chief of Ukraine's Air Force suggested last month that Ukraine could store some of its F-16s abroad to ensure that they're not destroyed by Russia, that would mean placing them at NATO bases in Europe, making them potential targets for the Russian military. And Russia has said if any NATO bases are housing Ukrainian jets that are actively being used in the war, then they would become potential targets. Ukraine is expected to receive its first F-16s from European NATO countries this month. The Netherlands has promised 24 F-16s for Ukraine and said on Saturday that they would be delivered without delay. So this is a big escalation, of course. This has been kind of a long time in the works. It was like last fall, or actually almost a year ago, I think, in August, that they started training the Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, and they're doing some of that training in the U.S. But this is a big escalation. This is the West, the NATO giving Ukraine these planes, these U.S.-made jets, giving them kind of an air force. It's small at this point. I believe that one of the big issues is that they haven't trained enough pilots for the planes, so they might only get a handful of F-16s at first. And then if Russia is, I'm sure Russia's going to make a point to target the F-16s once they get them. But we'll see what happens this month with that. All right, so the next one here. In Ukraine, killings of unarmed Russians divided a U.S.-led unit. So this one's from the New York Times. It's a pretty long story, but basically the summary of it is it's about one of these mercenary, foreign legions in Ukraine. That this one happens to be led by an American National Guard veteran, and a German medic that was in the group confronted his commander about the fact that they were killing unarmed Russians, people that should have been taken prisoner. They were just killing, and there were several incidents of this. I'll just read the first few paragraphs that describe one incident. Hours after a battle in eastern Ukraine in August, a wounded and unarmed Russian soldier crawled through a nearly destroyed trench, seeking help from his captors, a unit of international volunteers led by an American. Kasper Grossi, a German medic in that unit, said he saw the soldier plead for medical attention. In a mix of broken English and Russian, it was dusk. A team member looked for bandage. That is when, Mr. Grossi said, a fellow soldier hobbled over and fired his weapon into the Russian soldier's torso. He slumped, still breathing. Another soldier fired, just shot him in the head, Mr. Grossi recalled in the interview. Mr. Grossi said that he was so upset by the episode that he confronted his commander. He said he spoke to the New York Times after what he regarded as unwarranted killings continued. It is highly unusual for a soldier to speak publicly about battlefield conduct, particularly involving men whom he still considers friends. But he said he was too troubled to keep silent. So this guy's using his real name, and you have a picture of him here because he's so horrified by what the other mercenaries, this people in this foreign legion were doing. The shooting of the unarmed, wounded Russian soldier is one of several killings that have unsettled the Chosen Company, one of the best-known units of international troops fighting on behalf of Ukraine. And, of course, they spoke with the American commander, and, of course, he's denying this. But it's an interesting read if you want to go check that out, get into more of the details. All right, so the next one here. U.S. troops are leaving bases in Niger. So on Sunday, the U.S. military finished pulling troops out of Air Base 101 in Niger's capital, Niamey, as the U.S. withdrawal from the country is progressing. Air Force Major General Kenneth Ekman, who is on the ground overseeing the withdrawal, said Friday that less than 500 U.S. troops remain at Air Base 201, a major drone base located in Agadez that cost the U.S. over $100 million to build, so there's still some troops there. But they're scheduled to complete their exit in August, as the U.S. has a deadline of September 15th to get out of the country. 2/3 of the U.S. troops and equipment must be out of Niger by July 26th. So this withdrawal is happening. They're actually getting out. And Ekman said that a small number of U.S. Special Operations Forces, about 10 to 20 soldiers, have redeployed elsewhere in Africa, but the bulk of the U.S. troops being pulled out of Niger will be sent to Europe. So, Air Base 201, as we've covered this Niger withdrawal, I talk about Air Base 201 a lot. It's like this big base, and the U.S. did not want to give it up, but they were forced out after this July 2023 coup. They tried to stay, but they got a little, they started threatening the new government about their relationship with Russia and Iran, and they said, all right, that's enough, get out. And so now they're actually leaving. But the U.S. is in talks with other regional countries, including Benin, the Ivory Coast, and Ghana, about relocating their major drone base, or a new base of operations for the region is what they're looking for. Of course, the Americans, the U.S. isn't going to say, all right, we're just going to go home and that's it. They're going to try to find out a way that they could stay in the region. All right, so the next one here, Reformist Masoud Pezeshkian wins Iran election. I was practicing how to say his name before this, but I'm probably still butchering it. So Dr. Masoud Pezeshkian, he won the presidential election in Iran, and it was kind of an unexpected win. He's considered a moderate or a reformist, as they call them, and he defeated Saeed Jalili, who is considered a hardliner. And basically what that means is, a lot of times, the president who was killed in the helicopter accident, Ebrahim Raisi, he was considered, a hardliner. But when he came in, he was still trying to negotiate with the U.S. His foreign policy wasn't terribly different than his predecessor. So this is just an article from Trita Parsi from the Quincy Institute, his analysis of it. Basically, the big thing for our purposes, I don't know much about Pezeshkian, but he's saying that he favors negotiations with the West. He favors direct negotiations. That is one thing that the previous Iranian governments didn't want to deal directly with the U.S. after the Trump administration pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, but that's something he wants to do. The problem is that I don't think he's going to have a willing partner, a willing negotiating partner. There have been indirect negotiations between the U.S. and Iran just about keeping regional tensions down, just about avoiding escalation. I think those might continue, but I don't think Biden's going to try to negotiate any kind of deal with Iran between now and the election, which is really coming up soon. I mean, it's July already, so the election's really soon. And then Trump had one of the worst Iran policies. I don't see him coming in and wanting to make a deal with Iran, especially because he's going to be, super supportive of Israel. That's something Israel's not going to want. So, unfortunately, he probably won't have a willing partner, but maybe, you never know what could happen in the future. All right. So the next one here, Erdogan plans to invite Syria's Assad to Turkey. So on Sunday, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that he plans to invite Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to Turkey for talks on potentially restoring ties. So Erdogan said, quote, "We will extend our invitation to Assad. With this invitation, we want to restore Turkey-Syria relations to the same level as in the past. Our invitation may be extended at any time. We have now arrived at a point where if Bashar Assad takes a step toward improving relations with Turkey, we will also show that approach toward him," end quote. Excuse me. So Erdogan also made similar comments a few days earlier, and he said that he wants Putin, he wants the Russians to join the talks, he wants Putin to be there too. And Turkish and Syrian officials began holding Russian-mediated talks in December 2022. So that was a big step because Turkey was one of the biggest proponents and supporters of the failed regime change effort against Assad, helped flood Syria with these foreign fighters and weapons. And today, Turkey still occupies parts of northern Syria, and there's Turkish-backed militias there. But that's more about the Kurds, not so much about Assad. Turkey has given kind of de facto support to HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. That's the al-Qaeda group that controls most of Idlib in the northwest. But Turkey's big issue now in Syria is the Kurds, the YPG or the SDF, which is a U.S.-backed group. So basically, Syria, it's not clear right now if Erdogan invited Assad to visit Turkey, if Assad would go, because Syria's, condition is we will open up relations with you, normalize relations with you, but you have to withdraw from our territory. Maybe he would go to try to work out a deal, try to negotiate something, especially if Putin was on board, but we'll see what happens. The one potential solution for Syria and Turkey is the Turkish troops pulling out of these northern border areas, and instead of the SDF and the Kurds going back in there, you could have the Syrian Arab troops go there as kind of a buffer between Turkey and the Kurds. But the U.S. wouldn't go for that, and the U.S. is there in northeastern Syria, they would probably try to prevent something like that. So the U.S. is probably the impediment to any real deal here. And the U.S. does not want to give up its occupation of Syria, as I went over last week. They have no plans to get out. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Jonathan Grotenfent, Lessons from the Cold War, Now is the Time for De-Escalation. One from Edward Hasbrook, Playbook for a Military Draft. One from Michael Clare, Early Signs of Failure of American Global Power. One from Matthew Petty, Will Biden Drag Americans into a War in Lebanon? One from Julia Gledhill, Unlimited National Security Spending Doesn't Make the U.S. Safer. So please go check all of that out. And another thing I wanted to mention is the Ron Paul Institute conference that's coming up on it's August 31st in Dulles, Virginia, right near, it's basically Washington, D.C. It's the Washington Dulles Airport Hilton Hotel. And you guys should go. I will be there. It's going to be a great time. I went to one of their conferences 2 years ago, and it's really cool. And if you look at the speakers, especially, if you're interested in foreign policy, you have Ron Paul speaking, of course, John Mearsheimer, Judge Napolitano, Joel Salatin, who is a really interesting guy, regenerative farmer. That's what he's known for. And, of course, Dan McAdams is going to speak as well. And it's just going to these conferences are great. More speakers are going to be announced. I'm speaking at the student conference, which is a day earlier. They sponsor students. So I'll be there on Saturday hanging out. Tickets are $85. It's totally worth it. If you're coming from out of town, you would have to pay for the hotel, which they have a pretty good deal on the hotels. I think it's like $109 per night. I mean, that's not bad. And then we just hang out in the hotel, hanging out at the bar at night. It's a good time. So you guys should go, and let me know if you're going, and I'll see you there. So anyway, that is it for me. Support this show by sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe and comment and all that stuff. Follow us on X and Instagram. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.